Getting injured while climbing absolutely sucks, and to be honest, avoiding injuries might be one of the best ways to actually just improve in climbing in the long term. So today we're talking about the 2 best strategies to avoid injury in climbing. You'll likely have seen lots of suggestions about how to avoid injury, like proper hydration, making sure you do the right warm-up, or maybe even just avoiding dangerous techniques. While these things might be useful, they're not going to be nearly as effective as the 2 strategies we're going to discuss in this video. Before we get into the detail of those 2 strategies though, it's worth mentioning one important detail. We are not physiotherapists here at Lattice Training, we are climbing coaches. And here in the UK, if you want to get your information about sport-specific injuries, we need to talk to a physiotherapist. So to get a bit of background on sport-specific injuries to climbing, we're going to talk to our local physio, James Walker, who also works with the GB team here. We want to know from James what the biggest risk factors are and what actually gets climbers injured. The most common injuries in climbers happen in the upper extremities, so that's in the fingers, the wrists, the elbows, and the shoulders, with the top spot being taken by injuries in the pulleys. That's the connective tissue that holds the tendons to the bone while we're in that gripping position. Although it's still important, we won't be discussing traumatic injuries like falling onto an ankle badly. In this video, we're really talking about sort of overuse injuries that we can try and avoid in our climbing training.
Hi, my name is James Walker. I am a physiotherapist based at the Sheffield Climbing Clinic. I treat rock climbers on a daily basis, and the most common type of injuries I tend to see at the clinic are actually what we call your overuse injuries. Examples of overuse injury would be, say, a elbow tendinopathy, like a golfer's elbow or a tennis elbow, a pulley strain rather than a pulley rupture, or a rotator cuff related shoulder pain. And what we actually mean by overuse injuries is, rather than it being a specific trauma where you maybe pulled on a hold and something suddenly got damaged, we mean that the capacity of the tissue over time has been repetitively exceeded, and then the body will react in a certain way that causes pain in that tissue. In terms of how these injuries actually present in the clinic, we tend to see that there is a mismatch between the amount of load that is being put through these tissues over a period of time and the capacity of that tissue to take that load. So for example, if someone has suddenly started to train more, either increase the amount of climbing they're doing, they've added fingerboard into their routine, and they've done this at a trajectory that is too quick, then the amount of load is higher than the capacity of that tissue to take load, and that can cause pain. The other example of this is if someone would have a period of time off their climbing, where their load capacity is decreased in the tissues, and then they return to their climbing or training too quickly, again causing a mismatch of the load versus the load capacity. So the good news about these injuries is that if you understand load and load capacity and how the volume and intensity of your climbing and training affects this, they're actually quite preventable. And preventing these injuries will be one of the biggest factors in improving your climbing and progressing.
Okay, into the first strategy, and this is all about training tolerance. We know that a potential cause for injury is exceeding our capacity to tolerate the training we are doing. However, there's a bit of a catch-22 here. To get better at our sport, we want to increase the amount of training we do from time to time, so we need to somehow be able to tolerate more training while wanting to do more training at the same time. Without intervention, our body will naturally adapt over time to tolerate more training. However, the issue is that most of us as climbers want to get better fast, so we're always trying to ramp up the training as quickly as possible. So we need to know the strategy to do this safely. The strategy for this that has been practiced by coaches in almost every sport is strength and conditioning work. By this, I mean time spent in the gym, and this is going to be off the wall. So we're looking at those accessory or supplementary exercises we add to our training to improve our strength for the sport. Now, you might be thinking that this again is still going to be additional training, so the training load is going to increase as well, and this is going to bring with it more training stress, which we need to adapt to. Importantly, the S&C work we're going to be doing is in addition to the climbing we're doing, but with a great deal more variation than just climbing. Some simple examples here are pull-ups and press-ups and hangboarding. But importantly, we can control a lot of variables in this form of training, so the velocity of contraction, the intensity, the volume, the number of sets we do. And in this way, it's one of the most effective and safest ways of adding more training into your week. If we also get into slightly higher level programming, this kind of stuff gets pulled out of the training plan in those performance seasons or on climbing trips when you really want to push the performance. However, this video is about injury prevention and not necessarily performance. performance, although they're quite linked. So with this kind of training, what we're trying to do is really just increase the tolerance or the strength we have in a given area to support our climbing. It doesn't mean we're chasing PBs on the hangboard, for example. The greater capacity you have in your fingers and in your upper body, the more climbing you can do. And that is really the aim of this strength and conditioning. And the research is clear on this. Strength is protective and will help prevent injury. So if you've got niggly fingers, wrists, or elbows, just basic strength training in these areas is a great way to improve the resilience and start to mitigate some of the risk of something worse happening to that part of the body. Of course, the body is still going to adapt slowly to this extra training. The fact it's got more variation with the on the wall and off the wall work really helps, but we need to add this in slowly, just like we would with ramping up training on the wall. I do need to say this is a preventative strategy, and if you are currently injured, then what you're doing is going to look different to someone that is not injured. So if you're injured, please go see a healthcare professional and get advice from them. This brings us to tactic number 2, and that is load management. Here by load, we mean training load. So this is the cumulative amount of training you're doing in your week. This includes the volume of training doing, so the number of sessions you have, how long those sessions are, and that can be multiplied by the intensity of your training. So the proximity you are to your 1 rep max if you're weightlifting, or the intensity of the boulders you're doing. When we write training plans, we like to build a loading graph into the training plan so we can see the training load week on week as it goes through a training period. The key thing we're looking for in this loading graph is the acute to chronic workload ratio. Essentially, we don't want to see large peaks or troughs in that loading graph, and we don't want training in the long term to rise too quickly. Probably the biggest mistake in self-coached climbing is starting a training cycle or training block with too much training in that first week. Your first week or even your first few weeks should only be just a step above what you're currently doing now. If you're going to be adding additional exercises to your training plan, and that might be for the first strategy we discussed to try and build strength that's protective, we need to make sure that there's only a few exercises added in that first week, and that you're also going to start with a lower number of sets, but you can definitely increase this as you go through the training plan. Just remember to start off relatively easy with this one. All you're trying to do here is avoid a big spike in that training volume in those first few weeks. And although you might be able to make it through the first 4 or even 8 weeks, it's what happens when it all starts to accumulate later down the line when you've been training too hard for too long. In the long term, try to keep a diary or just a mental note of the number of sessions you've been doing, the focus of those sessions, and the intensity of those sessions. And you want to build this up over time, but just try not to deviate too far from that baseline. In fact, keeping a track of this training volume and the focus intensity of sessions can also be a great strategy for breaking through a plateau. If that baseline has been flat for a long time, then think about increasing it in one way, either through intensity or training volume. One of the most practical pieces of advice I can give about training load is that life and stress matter. Unfortunately, we still see the occasional injury, but there tends to be a common theme that runs through this, and that they tend to occur during stressful months in someone's life. And by stressful months, this can be anything from moving house, a change in your job, or maybe you've just had your first kid. This is going to add a huge bump in stress. We call this allostatic load, and it refers to the cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events. Although it might not be training, it is going to affect your balance between training and recovery, and the recovery side of that equation often doesn't get enough attention. Remember, you're recovering when you're at home or when you're at work, and if this stuff is stressful, then you're going to be suboptimally recovered when you get back to your next training session. On the topic of recovery, it's worth mentioning nutrition here. What you eat is going to affect how well and how quickly you recover from the training you're doing. Most people understand this, but what gets missed is increasing nutrient intake while increasing training. Remember that I said people tend to ramp up training too quickly at the beginning of a training cycle or a training block? Well, this can be compounded by the fact that people don't tend to ramp up their nutrient intake to meet the increased energy expenditure from that extra training. This simply can mean increased fatigue and insufficient recovery, which again is going to make all of those strategies we just implemented ineffective. I'm not a nutritionist, so we should leave the details up to the experts, but we think it's an important consideration nevertheless. There you have it. Those are the 2 strategies we think might be the most important to reducing the risk of injury in climbers. We haven't discussed any specifics, so we've not given any specific exercises that are really good to increasing that resilience But let us know in the comments below if you're doing any exercises you think are really effective at increasing your resilience to injury. If you found this video useful, subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and we'll see you next time.